Ciao, here is a conversation with Logan Kilpatrick. Logan is doing many things, but is mainly known for being the Julia language developer community advocate. And so we start talking about exactly that. We talk about Julia ecosystem, and particularly in the context of this week's Julia conference 2022. From there, we also talk about what happened to the Julia conference organization framework in the years of the pandemic and how this influenced and triggered some changes in the way they're working now. We also talk about some virtual reality / metaverse stuff in support of scientific communication and also scientific research. Then we dig into the Julia language itself. We argue, we try to outline why should people not into Julia get into Julia and use it. We also talk about specific packages living in the Julia ecosystem. Then we go into the differences and potential synergies between the open source perspective and decentralization and the DeSci movement in particular, decentralized science. From there, we talk about the financial way in which Julia is working, so the financial backend, let's say, and of course how the challenge associated to being having the right incentives in a decentralized, less open source perspective. In fact, we also talk about his involvement with NASA in a project about open science. Really interesting to talk about that. And we also talk about the use of the Julia language, in particular open source software in medicine, drug development, and from there his involvement, his full-time job actually, not involvement, in PathAI. So we talk about really many stuff. I hope you enjoy it. It was one of the most engaging, from my perspective, conversation I recorded, so I hope you enjoy as well. Thanks, Logan, for joining. The first question today is, of course, about the JuliaCon 22, which is upcoming next week, even though, as you said now, there are some warm-up events already. And the question is, 1, from Europe, can we get the Replu T-shirt? And 2, are you wearing the Julia socks today and during the conference?
So I only have one pair of the JuliaCon socks, so I will not be wearing them for the entire duration of the conference. I did put them on for our chat today, so I'm wearing the Julia socks as well as a pair of Julia slippers. So it is the ultimate combination. Nice. And for the Replu T-shirt, you should be able to get it in Europe. So we do ship those pretty much everywhere in the world. I think there's like a very few countries that are excluded, and those are actually excluded by the shipping provider, not by us, not being able to send them there. So I do believe we have tons of folks in Europe. I actually sent a shirt to Germany yesterday, so you should be able to get the Replu T-shirt in Europe.
Okay, great. Yeah, I would say, I have to, definitely these days I have to get one. But one question is maybe also related to what you were saying offline, that it's a ton of work for you to organize the conference. And you can see it from outside that there's many volunteering stuff going on, a lot of volunteering. And so maybe the question is, how can people, users, developers, curious people revolving around the Julia ecosystem, how can they support this movement? I don't know if you like this word, but
yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I think the fortunate part about the Julia ecosystem is that there are so many folks who are willing to support the ecosystem. I think one of the biggest ways is if your company is using Julia, sponsor JuliaCon. Like, I think it's an awesome opportunity to get a bunch of exposure for your company if you all are using Julia. If you're not, if you're doing it as more of a hobbyist, we have sort of ticket donations set up this year where technically JuliaCon is free, but if you want to quote unquote buy a ticket and donate that money to support the entire ecosystem, the entire Julia ecosystem, you can do that, because really JuliaCon is we were talking offline, and I said, I wish we could just pay somebody to do all the work for JuliaCon, because it's, again, a tremendous amount of work. But the reality is that JuliaCon is actually the biggest funding mechanism for the Julia ecosystem throughout the entire year. So we use the funds that we raise from JuliaCon to support infrastructure, pay for compute, pay for Julia Summer of Code contributors, all these different things. And all that money comes from JuliaCon. So we really do rely on the sponsorships from all the amazing companies that use Julia, people sort of donating and buying tickets, T-shirt sales, sock sales this year. We just added that this year as well. So trying to make sort of ends meet, support the ecosystem without requiring too much money. So it's a challenge, but those are some of the ways that folks can help out from a financial perspective, and happy to talk more broadly as well about just contributing to the ecosystem.
Yeah, no, my question now was specifically about the financial way of supporting Julia's ecosystem. It's, you can feel it, that the work is done regardless of the payment. So, I mean, this philosophy that's reflected in the fact that the ticket is free, but then you can support it. And I didn't know that, so thanks for sharing. It's really, you can feel it in participating. So I'm excited now talking, because I'm participating for the first time in JuliaCon 2022. I'm presenting a small work, so I feel part of it. Let me say that.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think just to make one more point, I think it's, again, not everyone has to make a financial contribution for you to be doing something really positive for the ecosystem. Like, the other part of JuliaCon, the major importance of it, besides just it being a huge funding mechanism for the ecosystem, is actually, it's also this huge ability for us to continue to expand the ecosystem by getting folks who are doing really cool stuff with Julia, like yourself, the platform to actually be able to talk about the cool stuff that they're doing. And that's, if you go back and look year over year, all the different JuliaCon videos that are out there, we have thousands of videos now of just case studies, basically, of how people are using Julia. And I think that stuff is super important in continuing to expand the ecosystem. So I appreciate even if it's not a financial contribution, just doing the work of using Julia and sharing about it at JuliaCon, I think is super important.
Right. I see. And about this, I'm not sure if, probably not, but I've seen that the conferences this year is fully online. I think you did something like that before in the context of the pandemic. I was curious to understand if you switched during the pandemic, or it was just a coincidence, let's say a reply to the environment, or was it more of a shift that you wanted to do because the community is so worldwide that it was worth jumping out of Boston? And I was curious about that, because I'm really interested in how to make research accessible to everyone.
Yeah, I think this is a great point. And I think, talking about all the travesty and all the bad stuff that happened during the pandemic, I think, one of the really positive elements, and I've heard, so many different folks say this, but it really sort of improved the accessibility of content like what would have been created at JuliaCon. I don't think that, obviously hindsight's 2020, and who knows what the future would have held if there hadn't been a pandemic, but I don't think we would have had the same sort of virtual conference material created if it wasn't for the pandemic. So I really do think that was the forcing factor. 2020, we really had to scramble and change, because JuliaCon was actually supposed to be in Lisbon, Portugal in 2020. 2021, we were sort of optimistic we'd be able to have it in Portugal. That didn't plan out. And after 2021, we were like, well, we really don't know what's going to happen. Let's just say for 2022 that we're going to be virtual just to play it safe. Now, again, in hindsight, maybe we would have been able to do something in person, but again, at what risk? There's COVID still out there, all that sort of stuff. So for 2023, we're hoping to be in person, actually back in Boston, just because of the uncertainty. But I totally agree. I think having a virtual component of the conference totally improves accessibility. No, not everyone is going to be able to travel, but I do think that for those who are able to travel, the in-person conference is going to be such a great experience in the future. And the real challenge with online conferences, and I feel this for myself, even as an organizer, is like I have all this other stuff going on, like a full-time job and things like that. So it's really hard to really block out like the full time
Right.
if I'm not physically there. Like I'm virtually there. So like I'm like, oh well, I'll take a meeting here and there. And like then it ends up snowballing into I don't get to spend as much time doing Julia stuff during JuliaCon that I would really want to.
Right.
And I think that's the case for a lot of people. Plus, folks are just generally burnt out with virtual conferences. So I think having something in person next year will be awesome. But we do have, for this year's JuliaCon, we do have in-person meetups around the world, actually, which is awesome.
Mm-hmm.
So if you go on the JuliaCon website, there's a local meetups tab, and you can actually see whether or not there's a meetup being hosted in your country or in your city or something like that. And there's a bunch of them. So hopefully that will help sort of bridge this gap.
Mm-hmm. Right, I see. And so the challenge, let's say, for next year is to maintain the accessibility that was a consequence of the pandemic, but also enable back what's in person, what you get in person. Do you have an idea on how to do that? I was curious also about this metaverse hype. I was curious to hear your point on. I think there's a professor from Stanford talking about the fact that the best use case for this VR stuff is going to be education and science. I don't know, education. So do you see something like this?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the reality is we're so far still from any sort of viable, usable metaverse. I think the closest thing right now is Gather Town, which we've used for conferences before, and it's you're just moving around. It looks like you're playing Game Boy. So you can see like the technology is very, very far away from it being high fidelity and anything close to an in-person conference. But again, I do think that for us in 2023, we'll probably have something like very similar to what we're doing now, which is streaming live the actual presentations, and then we'll probably have chat or something like that on Discord, and people asking questions there, and then we'll probably physically in the room have somebody who's sort of acting on behalf of the live audience, and they'll be like, hey, this person has a question, and sort of asking in person what those virtual questions are, or something of that form. I don't think we've fleshed out all the details because we're still trying to pull off JuliaCon 2022, but it'll be a challenge, I think, but it's going to be the right thing to do to make sure that the virtual audience can still participate in as much of the event as possible.
Right. I see. So there's going to also be a Discord for this year as well.
Yeah, there is a Discord. So if you're registered for JuliaCon, you should have an email in your inbox or maybe your spam folder, as I've seen it be a couple of times with folks I've chatted with. But you should have a link to a Discord. We do that every year now, and yeah, that's where all the sort of conference chat is happening.
Which is separate from the people of Julia, I think. There's a Discord server.
Yeah, separate from the Humans of Julia Discord. I think we made the decision that it would probably be best to have something that was fresh, just so that people weren't confused about, whatever the dynamics that are set up for the Humans of Julia Discord versus, Slack, Zulip, all these other things. So traditionally, we've just made a new Discord every year for the conference specifically, and then we erase it afterwards, which, has its trade-offs, but it ends up giving folks a clean slate to actually go in, and we also don't want to mess with all the stuff that the folks on the Humans of Julia Discord have set up with respect to all their channels and stuff like that. So it seemed like a cleaner solution.
Right, and only the attenders, how do you say, the people presenting at JuliaCon are going to be there, or also people that registered as audience?
Yeah, so registered attendees are welcome to be there. Yeah, so I would say it's mostly actually for the registered attendees. So for someone who's just attending JuliaCon, that's where you're going to be able to ask questions, talk to speakers, like after a presentation is over, that's where you'll ask your question, because the videos aren't, with the exception of workshops, keynotes, and a few other things, none of those things are happening. None of the other talks are happening live. It's all pre-recorded. But yeah, all the question and answering will happen via Discord.
Right. Yeah, so probably now it's time for the the main question. So why should one use Julia? Someone listening now that doesn't know about Julia, why should they start looking into it? In particular, actually, I had a specific question that I always overlooked, and maybe this relates also to your full-time job, which is the use of Julia for machine learning. And I mean, I touched on that for the scientific machine learning part for dynamical systems, and the use of neural networks and machine learning techniques for data-driven dynamical systems. But let's say to train a black box model, which is not physics informed, I've seen some good benchmarks comparing it to TensorFlow and PyTorch. So can you maybe say something about that? The machine learning.
This is an excellent question. I think, the reality and the challenge at the present moment is that TensorFlow and PyTorch have such a massive ecosystem and so much engineering dollars flowing into both of those packages from both Google and from Facebook. So it's just really difficult to pin Julia up against TensorFlow and PyTorch. I think if you do make that comparison, I think most engineers, most folks will end up settling on the fact that, hey, it probably makes more sense for me today to use TensorFlow or PyTorch, depending on the use case. I think where Julia is really starting to, and again, to take a step back, I would say that's through the lens of deep learning. If deep learning is what you want to do using PyTorch or TensorFlow, which I guess is what most folks are doing in machine learning these days, TensorFlow and PyTorch is probably more advanced as far as capabilities go. You can use Flux or MLJ.jl. Both of those are, I think, viable. But again, Flux is a community of people who have come together because they care about deep learning and they care about Julia, and they've made something that's incredible. But obviously, we don't have millions of dollars being spent to develop the Flux ecosystem. So it's just at a different point in its journey. I think, again, going back to what I was going to say, which is, I think most of the real value that's being created with Julia in the machine learning space is with the scientific machine learning space. So Chris Rackauckas and all the folks in that ecosystem, that's where sort of the magic is happening in the machine learning perspective. So I think if you're doing scientific machine learning, if you're sort of at the intersection of machine learning and sort of the physical sciences or some other sort of aspect of science, and you're not just trying to train a deep learning model to, predict the value of a house or something like that, whatever the traditional deep learning problems are, I think Julia can be a super viable use case in some of those situations. And I think, again, taking a step back, which was, the question of why Julia to begin with, I think it really just depends on your use case. Like, thinking long and hard about what the tool that you're going to use is part of solving any problem, any engineering problem. So I think it's, am I solving a problem that Julia would be well suited to solve? Mm-hmm. I would say if you're in a scientific domain, likely, like if you're trying to, model some physical system or model some, the sort of outbreak of a pandemic, all those types of things are really sort of well suited for Julia's use case. But if you're trying to build, a massive recommender system at the scale of, Google or Netflix, probably PyTorch or something like that is going to be a better option for you.
Right. Yeah. So let me add one point. Let me do, as you're doing the devil's advocate much, I'd like to say maybe someone listening should definitely look into Julia if they're working on integrating numerically differential equations. Because of the efficiency and the combination of efficiency and solving the fact that they're solving the two-language problem. You are solving the two-language problems. And but beside this, I remember reading about the fact that it's kind of like a meta language that allows you to do something. I've never understood that. I saw that a few years back. Then it wasn't interesting for me at the time. So could you explain that capability which is a low-level feature of Julia, I think?
Yeah. Are you saying that? So one of the cool features of Julia, and correct me if this isn't what you were saying. One of the cool features is that the syntactically, Julia can be really, really similar to actual math that you would see in a paper or somewhere else in the world. So that for a lot of folks who are coming from like a scientific domain, they're really familiar with the math, but they're perhaps less familiar with, how do I program this in Python or Julia? So the fact that Julia syntax is closer to the math means that it's a little bit easier for those folks to make the transition to using Julia, or just make the transition to using some computational tool to help them with their research. And the reason that that's sort of enabled is because Julia has Unicode support, so you can have mathematical symbols represented as variables and throughout different types of equations. So you get this really nice sort of visual depiction of this, which is you could have like a paper with some math equation on the left and then the Julia code on the right. And you can look at the two and be like, oh, okay, this actually makes sense to me, just visually looking at them. And I think if you sort of add another layer to this and look at the Python code or some other language next to the Julia code, it becomes very clear that there's this divide between, just from a syntax perspective, how you would do these things. And I think, again, for folks in the math domain, it's a little bit easier for them to do math in Julia versus Python or another language because of the syntax.
Right. And about the other point, so how, because I've been working on projects in which you have to know C++, Python, and how to interact with each other, and it's kind of a nightmare. And with Julia, I would hope that solving the same kind of problems would simply lead to the development of Julia packages, and that's it.
Yeah.
How is that possible?
Yeah, so I think, again, Julia solves this traditional two-language problem, which is, in other languages, if you're in the Python ecosystem, a lot of the times, and I actually think the deep learning and machine learning packages are a great example of this. People think that TensorFlow and PyTorch are Python packages. They're not really Python packages. If you look under the hood for TensorFlow and PyTorch, they're really C++, C, Fortran in some cases, machine learning frameworks that they've added this Python wrapper on top of in order to make it so that it's computationally efficient enough to solve the problems that it's trying to solve. And again, you can look at Flux, for example, which is the Julia deep learning package, and it's written in 100% Julia. So you don't have to understand, again, if I'm an engineer using PyTorch or TensorFlow, if I want to take a peek under the hood, I not only have to be a PyTorch or a Python expert, I have to be a machine learning expert, and I have to be an expert in C++ or C or whatever the underlying language is that the package is written in. So Julia sort of flips that on its head and says, we can basically use Julia all the way down to the low-level hardware stack with CUDA or something like that, and we can program in Julia for the entire software stack, which really, as a developer, makes life that much easier. But you also have the added benefit of Julia having, first-class support for interoperability. And if you want to, have some C++ code or some Python code or R or MATLAB or Java interact with your Julia code, that works pretty much out of the box. So there's not a lot that you need to do to enable that functionality. And it's, again, I think one of the things that has enabled Julia to grow to the point that it's at today is, if the value proposition for Julia was, hey, you can use Julia, you can get these speed improvements and these ease of use improvements, but you have to rewrite everything you have from the ground up in Julia. I don't think people would really be transitioning like they are. But I think the fact that you can, hey, maybe I want to change some of my code, but I want to leave some of it, and I'll just interop this code and use PyCall to call some Python package within my Julia code. The fact that you can do that, I think, has enabled more people to be comfortable saying, hey, I'll give Julia a try for this specific thing, but I don't want to rewrite, 10,000 lines of code that I have in Python. I'll just rewrite this small section and see if I can get the performance improvement that I need.
Right. Yeah, thank you for the outline. I have changing topic, a question about, as we said at the beginning, Julia is really focused on open source software development and this shared economy perspective. Also, I've seen that the proceedings of this year's conference are under the Creative Commons framework. So I wanted to ask you if you're familiar with the recent decentralized science movement, and if you think there's a potential dialogue. I mean, they seem like related words. So because the SCI seems to build on top of open access, so yeah, I don't know. Are you familiar with the SCI, and do you see some potential in integrating the two viewpoints?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I'm less familiar with DSci and more familiar with just open science. I think I'm not sure, and maybe you can help clarify like if there's a line or a boundary between open science versus decentralized science. I don't know if there is.
Yeah, I don't know either. I have read that DSci came out as a consequence of some unexpected problems with open science, like the fact that actually I've seen a Nature article a few days back about the fact that open science basically unexpectedly lifted up the fees for developing countries to I don't know how, but to either submit papers or read them, and so there was this issue about inequality. But I think this is probably the border is between the use of IPFS and blockchain technology to develop an open science. So it's probably a subset of open science, an open science framework.
Yeah, I think the reality with decentralization right now is that in principle, I think there's a lot of people who totally are on board with the idea. Like I think it makes total sense. For me, one of the biggest things that is the real impotence for why decentralization should exist is something like the internet. The fact that we all use the internet, it's basically this global storage of all human knowledge. But really, there's all these different corporations around the world that control everyone's access to the internet. And I think that's one of the things in the world that should 100% be decentralized. I would be happy to pay in some of my money to make sure that I'm part of that decentralized web instead of paying Comcast or whoever to give me access to the internet. But the challenge is that, and I think this is going to be the same in the open science space and the DeSci space, is that blockchain has just a really bad reputation and brand right now that I think people who are serious about open science are going to stay away from any of these decentralization things with a 10-foot pole, because they don't want to be, marketed and branded and clumped in with all the NFT, scam stuff that happens in the blockchain space, when again, the underlying fundamental technology is sound, and obviously blockchain is a usable piece of technology. But I think that, again, there's so many examples of this, and there's also a ton of people in the open science space who have gotten burned by the blockchain crypto crowd. And a good example of this is MyBinder, for example, like the free compute service where you can basically like launch a Jupyter notebook in your browser and like run it without having to install anything locally. Like MyBinder has to do all of this work every year to stop people from trying to use their service to mine crypto. And I think that, again, there's all these people in the open source, open science space who see things like that happening, and I think it just gives them a bad taste in their mouth about the whole decentralization. But again, in reality, it's something that we should have in the open science space, but it's not something that I think is going to have a meaningful impact in the next 3 to 5 years. Maybe beyond that, it will, but it's just not. It's going to take more time.
Right. And what about? So you think is there something we're leaving behind from the closed source? I don't know how to call it. The pre-Aaron Swartz phase, the pre-internet probably. Are we forgetting about something that was good about it? Like, are we underestimating the importance of gatekeeping? I don't know how to say it. If there's a better way of saying it, but no,
that's 100% right. I think the problem that people always forget about open source is that open source is a privilege. Like the fact that I get to spend my time, contributing to the Julia community is because I am a white male who has the privilege of, I have a job that pays me well and I have free time to spend and do all this different stuff. And again, I think the problem with that ecosystem is I have this privilege, I have this ability to contribute to open source, and it also just compounds these things. Like I've had, because I had this privilege and this ability, I've had the ability to, do all this stuff, support the Julia community, which sort of, has helped my career in all these different ways. But again, if I didn't have that privilege to start with, I wouldn't have been able to reap those rewards and those benefits. And that's really the problem with open source in a nutshell. It's
Right.
the people who are there have some form of privilege, and if you don't have the time, the money, the know-how, then you're not able to reap those rewards. So it's really challenging. And again, I'm not sure that there's any like good, elegant solutions to the problem besides, I don't know. It's probably a longer topic about how to address that. I think we have to do what we can, and we do this in the Julia ecosystem as much as possible to, be intentional and support diversity and inclusion in every way that we can. But that's most of the time still not enough to help sort of resolve this problem.
Okay, so this is from your experience as well. I mean, I read it as a really high-level criticism. So it was about the financial incentives, but in your experience as well, since it's open source, you're not paid to develop it, and so to arrive at having the time, the resources to do that, you have to have some kind of privilege that's enabling you.
100%. And again, once the flip side of this is, again, it's that reinforcement mechanism as well. Like, okay, so now, you had the privilege to write some Julia package that's now fundamental and used across the ecosystem. And now when you go to, apply to be a professor, a tenured professor, or for some job, they're like, oh, look at this. You have this, foundational package in the Julia ecosystem. We're going to think favorably of you in this job process versus someone else who doesn't have that open source experience because they had less privilege and they had something else going on in their life. So it's that reinforcement mechanism that I think obviously there needs to be some incentive for people to do free labor, which is what open source is in a lot of cases. But it's what are the repercussions and what is the long tail impact of people doing that free labor? And I think for the people doing it, it can oftentimes be really beneficial. Like I'm super grateful that I have the ability to do this work, but I think just being reminded of the fact that not everyone does, and it's definitely a privilege to be able to do it.
Right. Yeah. Can we keep, if you don't mind, can we keep trying to talk about this? Because, for example,
Sure.
let's see. Let's say at least let's recognize to the open source movement that then the code is open source, and so even if you didn't have the time to develop it because you're not as lucky as someone else, you can use it. But can you do more? So can Julia, now I'm talking to Julia because I talked to you, but can open access bring back, pay developers, pay creators, pay creative people? And so I'm going back to DCI, sorry, but NFTs are how's it called, the API club. Maybe it's a bad thing that's happening, but maybe there are many artists, creators that were not able to get their works out there because of, I don't know, gatekeeping. I don't know, to be a painter, you needed to be in the circle of guys. And maybe with OpenSea, you just drop an NFT collection, and if it's valuable, you get money. So could both open source code development and science make use of something like that? Is there a solution? Do you see a solution for, I have met a kid, I mean, I call him a kid, is I think a first year bachelor student from China, which developed this super cool Julia library for fractional calculus. And I think he's not getting money for it. I mean, he's doing a great job. How can we pay him? I mean, how can he get money for that?
Yeah, I think again, this goes back to, there's all this benefit and incentive in the open source community, and there's all this good that comes from it. But I think that one of the biggest challenges is that the people who have money in the open source ecosystem are very keen on not letting go of that money. Like, again, who's reaping the rewards and the benefits of, all the stuff that happens to the Julia ecosystem. It's, all of these Fortune 500 companies, it's, Apple, it's Google, it's Facebook, it's, Tesla, people doing research, all these different companies, same thing for any other open source ecosystem and community. But you see all this usage flowing into these companies. I don't see any money flowing back from any of those companies that I just mentioned. I'm sure some of them are doing, some development of Julia in some capacity, but they're not making a direct financial contribution back into the ecosystem. And I think that's the only way that it works financially, is to have companies show up, pay their fair share. And I don't think that the problem is the open source ecosystem isn't set up to do that. Like, I think companies are doing it now from a branding perspective in a lot of sense. I think they're doing it because it looks good. I think there's also sort of a parallel movement to sort of the marketing aspect of contributing to open source, which is from a security standpoint. I think companies are realizing, hey, we're sort of building our entire company on these tools and services provided by the open source community. Maybe it would make sense for us to invest in them, because if something goes wrong, we're basically screwed, and we need to have some sort of levers to be able to fix security issues. So I think that's a really big, important movement. But yeah, I hope that there'll be other funding mechanisms as well in the future. I think whether or not it's DeFi stuff, potentially, I think GitHub sponsors is a huge, has been a really important sort of step in this direction for the ecosystem. The Julia community obviously benefits from that. We have like close to 200 people sponsoring us on GitHub. But
and how does it work? The sponsor, is it a monthly fee or something like that, or
exactly pay a monthly fee? Yeah, but and the cool part too is, and I think GitHub has been smart about this, which is, if you open an issue or you comment on something or a pull request, it actually shows up that you're a sponsor. So there's that added sort of badge that you're truly not just a contributor, but you're also a sponsor of this project. And hopefully, I don't know if your ideas are heard louder or something like that, but hopefully that sort of has some benefit to you as the person who's paying the project every month. But even with 200 people sponsoring us every month, it's obviously those people are very kind and generous, but it's a drop in the bucket as far as how much money is out there. And we have 200 people sponsoring us, but there's 100,000, 500,000, however many Julia developers out there. So it's a very, very, very small percentage of people who are making that contribution. So it's interesting to think about it in that context.
Right. I'll keep these in mind. And about this, I guess this is I don't remember. I think I've seen it in the JuliaCon page. The NumFOCUS. It was one of the sponsors. I've seen you're kind of related to them. Personally, I've seen maybe in your Twitter handles there's something about them. But yeah, anyhow. I was curious about, as they're a sponsor, how the financial part of Julia, how did you kick off, basically? I don't know when you started getting involved, but how did this thing started rolling?
Yeah, so I got involved in the Julia ecosystem. I think I started using Julia first back in 2017, 2018. I got more involved. I got officially involved in the project as the community manager at the beginning of 2020. Spent a little over 2 years as the community manager, and then my title sort of changed to developer community advocate, more so focused on, again, the reality was I wasn't sort of managing the community. I was advocating on behalf of the community. I was supporting the community. So the title change makes a lot of sense. But to go back to what NumFOCUS is. So NumFOCUS is the Julia project's fiscal sponsor. And I think the terminologies need to change, because this makes it seem like NumFOCUS just has a big pile of cash and they're like, here, Julia project, here's all this money, we're going to fiscally sponsor you. That's not how it works. So I'm on the board of directors of NumFOCUS, which is a 501c3 nonprofit in the US. And NumFOCUS supports a ton of open source projects. And how it does that is by providing the legal and financial infrastructure for projects like Julia, Jupyter, Pandas, NumPy, SciPy, scikit-learn, all these other open source projects, SciML and the Julia ecosystem, Flux. It provides the legal and financial infrastructure for these projects to accept donations, receive grants, all this other stuff related to financial stuff, as well as the legal infrastructure to pay for independent contractors, pay for bug bounties, pay for development. So really focus on the legal and financial infrastructure of the project. And then there's all these other benefits as well, like support for Google Summer of Code. There's small development grants that NumFOCUS gives to projects every, I think, 3 times a year, all this other stuff that NumFOCUS does. But truly the sort of main benefit is that we as the Julia project can legally accept donations from people. We can take in sponsor dollars during JuliaCon, and all that money is managed and handled by NumFOCUS. And they take a fee for doing all this for us. But truly for us, it's a great benefit because I don't need to do the Julia taxes every year. I don't need to worry about, the legal ramifications of us taking money from some company or paying an independent contractor in India or something like that. Like, we don't have to deal with any of that. It's all handled by NumFOCUS, which is really, really nice. And we can really focus on the things that we're all excited about and none of the challenges. So that's the sort of main piece. And I think the way that the Julia project brings in money, again, is we talked before about JuliaCon is one of the main funding mechanisms for Julia as an ecosystem. So that money comes in usually from sponsors, from ticket sales, T-shirts, all that stuff. And then we have some of those other things that run throughout the year. We sell T-shirts throughout the year, things like that. Sponsors on GitHub. But really, JuliaCon is sort of the big fish of the year, if you will.
Right. I see. Okay. Right.
Yeah,
I think Julia is a legal entity. I mean.
Yeah, so we're a legal entity that's part of NumFOCUS. So we don't have right now we don't have a separate foundation or anything like that. I think it's something we've thought about for the future, and I've had a bunch of conversations. But like Rust, for example, Python, a bunch of these other languages have their own foundation. But for us, NumFOCUS provides so much value, and we don't have to deal with all that, like the stuff that basically nobody wants to do. So it's really nice that we have NumFOCUS to help support us in that way.
Right. I see. And beside this, let's see how you mentioned you see maybe this in the future. What do you see in the next 5 years, 10 years for Julia? 5 years, let's say. 10 is too much, probably.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things happening in the Julia ecosystem that aren't sort of formalized right now. Like, I think even just from a governance perspective, I think Julia is still, as an ecosystem, very immature. Like, if you start to look more at, more bigger open source project, there's just a lot more mechanisms in place as far as, how do we make decisions about how certain things happen. I think we've sort of benefited in the Julia ecosystem from having a small ecosystem so we can be quick and nimble. But I think as the ecosystem continues to expand over the next 5 years, I think we'll get more formal with things. Hopefully we'll, have more folks working in a full-time capacity. I would love to see, some sort of corporate sponsorship on a yearly basis program coming out. It's something that I've thought about in the last year. Just seeing how well that works for other open source projects, like the Django project, for example, and others have yearly corporate sponsors. And I think that would be a great way for us to, again, continue to be fiscally solvent as an open source project. So I think it makes sense to do that. And again, adoption will continue to grow. I think all the technical stuff will continue to get better. Without a doubt, more people will be using it because hopefully the rough edges will be solved. And yeah, there's a lot of exciting things. For me, it's really sort of the maturing of the ecosystem that I'm excited to see. I think there's just so many things that we don't have right now that hopefully we will in the future. And whether it's 5 or 10 years, I think it's going to happen. It's just a question of how quick.
Implementation-wise, like missing technical solutions.
Missing technical solutions, but also just things in the community that we need to grow sustainably long term. I think hopefully in the next 5 years we'll have figured a lot of those out. Like small things, we use Slack right now. to do a lot of communication. I think long term we need to be off of Slack because it's just not the right tool for our open source project to continue to grow into the future.
Right. Can I ask, what do you envision as an alternative?
It could be Discord. It could be Zulip. It could be something else. I really, honestly, I don't care at this point. As long as it's not Slack, I'm happy. It just, yeah, something where ideally where people won't ask technical questions. Hopefully, we can get people onto Discourse or Stack Overflow instead of asking technical questions on Zulip and Slack. I just think that that's such a shame. The question is literally disintegrated and it goes away. And I think people make the argument that, well, for folks who aren't comfortable asking the question publicly, the reality is you can make a pseudo-anonymous Stack Overflow account and go and ask a question. No one's going to stop you from doing that. So if you're not comfortable putting your name on your question, that's totally fine and that's fair. But I don't think that the right solution is to allow people to ask questions that just then get evaporated on Slack because we don't pay for premium Slack.
Right. And so the idea would be to get Discord or Zulek. I didn't know that one.
Yeah, Zulip is an open source chat platform, and yeah, Discord is not open source. It's obviously a for-profit company, but I think that they've done a nice job of building community features, and I think the interface is actually a little bit better than Zulip. I think Zulip needs more user interface design help than Discord does.
Okay, and in parallel, have this reproducible technical part on GitHub, and also about maybe is GitHub for profit? So is GitHub a problem? Let's say I'm now in this perspective challenging everything also about myself.
Yeah.
Is GitHub a good place? I mean, I don't know.
It's a challenge. Like I think like one of the biggest things, and I'm doing all this stuff with open science now and thinking about open science, and one of the folks who's on this open science advisory panel at NASA with me made a bunch of comments about how are we looking at and addressing vendor lock-in. Like basically the reality is so much of the open source community is tied into GitHub, and thank God the folks at GitHub have been very kind and generous and are pro open source. But hey, you know what? Tomorrow they get a new CEO and decide, we don't really care about open source. We're an enterprise company. We want to make money that way. And they stop supporting the open source ecosystem. That could be a huge catastrophic blow to the open source ecosystem because so much of what we do is based on GitHub. I think, again, the argument for GitLab is that some of their stuff is open source and you can see the code. I'm not really sure that makes it any better. I mean, it's like a little bit better, but the reality is it's the same sort of challenge. Again, I could see the Git infrastructure being something that is a candidate for decentralization. I think that would make sense to me to have some sort of decentralized version of GitHub validated on the blockchain. But again, I think people are far away from that being the reality today.
Yeah, I can mention maybe here there's a DeSci group called Radical that I have no idea what the details are, but they're integrating Git with Ethereum. I don't know the details.
Nice. Yeah.
So there's some soft, but I think it's only from the perspective of the developer. I'm not sure, but
yeah. So it makes sense.
But is it a problem of the fact that the servers are of a company? So is the server the problem?
Yeah, I don't think it's a problem right now. Like I know so many folks who work at GitHub who have such great intentions, and I think they're doing really like I think the reality is open source wouldn't be where it is today without GitHub. Like that's a fact. Like they've made open source, for better or for worse, like the way that it is today is because of all the work that the folks at GitHub did over the last 10 years to make the ecosystem more accessible than it was previously. So I think they should get their acknowledgement and their award when the time comes. But again, from a long-term perspective, do you want to have all the open source ecosystem tied up in GitHub? Probably not. I think the folks at GitHub are probably aware of this. And I actually could see them potentially doing some of the decentralization themselves over the next 5 years as they start to think about their own product. Maybe they'll just end up being, sort of the visual interface into this decentralized storage of code, but really that interface could just be swapped out with some other interface, and then you're totally good and fine. So potentially that will end up being the way it looks.
Right. Yeah, I've never thought about talking with GitHub. I've never thought about considering as a peer. So yeah, this is opening up some ideas. Yeah, and so once again, Julia is living on GitHub.
Yeah, the source code lives on GitHub. I think there's mirrors on GitLab. Maybe there's some folks who are doing development on GitLab, but the code is, and the active development for most of the Julia ecosystem, I would say probably like 95% is happening on GitHub right now.
Right. And you mentioned it. This project on the open science movement, transform to open science, TOPS.
Yeah.
This project by NASA. You're part of some committee. Sorry for not. You mentioned it.
Yeah. So I'm lucky enough to be on the Transform to Open Science, TOPS is the acronym, NASA Community Advisory Panel.
Right.
So really just helping support NASA as an organization as they make the transition to open science principles, and also helping NASA sort of work in the community in the right ways to make sure that they're using their influence to promote open science. And I think from NASA's perspective, it makes perfect sense. Like it's a part of the U.S. government sort of set out to make science and information more accessible and expand all the sort of scientific stuff that's happening in the U.S. And so for it to be a leader in open science makes perfect sense. And I think there's a ton of work that's happening there with TOPS. I think part of it is developing curriculum to actually teach scientists what does it mean to do open science, what are the best practices. So all that work is ongoing at the moment, which is really exciting. 2023 is going to be the year of open science, according to NASA. So hopefully there'll be some awesome programming happening in that sense. There'll be tons of events, and really NASA's made a meaningful financial commitment, $40 million over the next 5 years to actually help push this forward, which I think is awesome. So hopefully, they're hoping to be the catalyst for a lot of this change happening in the open science space, and it's going to be really exciting to see what happens.
Right, interesting. And so yeah, I'm asking this, and sorry for asking so late, but I'm an aerospace engineer myself, and I work for the European Space Agency, and so this is, how do you say, cutting close to the bone in a good way. Yeah, if you could say more about your involvement, and in particular, if there's some relation with Julia. I was also thinking about the potential of using Julia for orbital mechanics.
Yeah,
solutions.
so I actually, my Julia journey started at NASA. So my first internship was working at NASA, using the team that's how I learned Julia. The team that I joined at NASA just happened to be using Julia to do the planning and development of a piece of software that helps plot out and plan lunar traverses in this case, but it works on traverses on any celestial body with any type of rover or spacecraft. So we actually built this framework using POMDPs and MDPs to actually simulate the traverse for the upcoming NASA Lunar Viper mission in 2024. So the traverse and the path that the rover is actually going to take was plotted and sort of calculated and built using this software that I worked on, written in Julia while I was at NASA. So super exciting. I think when that mission launches, I'll be in Florida to see the space launch, which will be really exciting. But yeah, I think there are a ton of folks across NASA who are using Julia, because I think the problems that folks are solving at NASA is perfectly in line with with Julia. And I think there's a bunch of different groups. I think in my case, the folks that I was working with were part of the intelligence systems group at NASA Ames in Mountain View, California. So a lot of them had ties. Like my mentor, for example, he did his PhD at Stanford and was part of the intelligence system labs at Stanford, and run by a guy named Michael Kirkendorfer, who has done all this amazing work in the Julia ecosystem, but also broadly in the decision-making under uncertainty ecosystem, and actually built, like the FAA's collision avoidance system for planes is actually built in Julia. And that was one of the initial use cases for them building POMDPs.jl, MDPs.jl, and then all this peripheral ecosystem for MDPs and POMDPs using Julia.
Which year was this?
So I joined this team, I think, right at the beginning part of 2018.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so, and the current dialogue with NASA, is Julia involved, or are you involved as an open science expert?
Yeah, so I'm involved in my capacity both in the Julia ecosystem, but also from a NumFOCUS perspective as well. So NumFOCUS sort of one step broader than the Julia specific ecosystem, but again, I think this initiative is more broadly about open science and less about like the specific tools in which we're using to do open science. So it's, there's not a lot of conversations about Julia specifically, but I think broadly at NASA, there's a bunch of folks that I've talked to who are using Julia, which is really exciting, and definitely folks who broader than NASA are using Julia to do space stuff. Like there's a bunch of really great JuliaCon talks actually about how folks are using Julia for space stuff. So it's been super exciting to see.
Right. And so this is even more general than software development, let's say. It's
science. Totally. Because it's about like the open access to like data and stuff like that. So it's not, I think open source programming is one sort of facet of this, but it's open access to data, it's open access to papers and all this other stuff. So it's much broader than just open source software.
Right. Great. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, as I told you, I think I wrote you. I'd like to copy NASA and let ESA copy NASA at least, or contribute to the ecosystem in a way that pushes ESA to follow this lead in the open science in aerospace. Because I don't know, maybe I'd also like to ask you a final question about how there's so much overlap between Julia and the data-driven perspective of healthcare and medicine and drug development and all these topics that you're working on. And so to go back to the initial thought is, I see a lot of potential of pushing forward open science in aerospace. There are so many wasted resources in not doing that I've seen. And so, yeah, this is not a question. But the question is, do you see the same in your field, in the data-driven medicine? And also the initial question I had was, why so many applications in medicine for Julia? Is this a coincidence or?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think so. My full-time job right now, I work at a company called PathAI, which is using machine learning and deep learning to improve patient outcomes with AI-powered pathology is the sort of mission statement. And what that actually means is basically using machine learning and deep learning to help support pathologists who are making cancer diagnoses. Instead of them just looking under a microscope and making the cancer diagnosis, they have this support from machine learning models, deep learning models to improve their ability to make cancer patient diagnoses. And again, throughout clinical trials, through actual diagnoses in a lab, it's really exciting. I think it's a super cool use case. We're not using Julia to do that, and part of the reason why is because much of the work that we're doing is traditional deep learning. So it's not sort of pharmacology. It's not using sort of that sort of piece of it. Whereas, like, for example, Puma's AI, which is sort of built from the ground up on Julia, and a bunch of folks in the Julia ecosystem, like Chris Rackauckas and others, are involved in that company. That's really where they're sort of leveraging Julia, and it's less about deep learning in that sense, and it's more about using differential equations and all the other cool fancy math stuff that Chris and those folks do to find solutions. And I think the reason that you see Julia being used so much for this work is because the other solutions are just not viable in today's environment. Like, I know, for example, Pfizer, which is obviously so popular now because of all the COVID stuff and vaccines, but they're a user of Julia. Moderna, one of the keynote speakers for JuliaCon this year, is the head of some division at Moderna, and I forget exactly which one, but so these folks are using Julia because it fundamentally helps them solve their problems significantly faster. Like, I think in the case study for Pfizer, or it was Pfizer or Moderna, I forget, it was 175x speed up in their simulation. So you take something that was taking a day or two to run a full simulation for some drug, and you bring that down to a few minutes, or 30 seconds or something like that. And you can see the innovation that can happen. Now all of a sudden you can, try out thousands and thousands and thousands of different combinations for some of these drugs where you were previously limited by the computational resources that you had. So it just makes a ton of sense in the space because of how much computational resources are required to do some of these calculations.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah. I'm just looking. The keynote speaker is the head of the clinical pharmacology and pharmacometrics at Moderna. Wow.
It'll be awesome. We're excited.
Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to that. And it's actually humbling to think my speech at JuliaCon is going to be about, Julia is efficient so we can make cool animations. Well, this guy is, it's efficient so we can save the humanity, But,
I mean, everyone's playing their part in it. I think it's, it's important.
Yeah, I mean, one shows that you can make cool figures, and then the guy that can save the world says, I can do something like, I can copy that in some sense. Really interesting. And are you aware of the work conducted? I've seen an interesting sponsor, which is kind of in between PathAI and Pumas. I mean, in between in my mind, in the sense that they could be potentially using this scientific machine learning. And sorry, I don't remember the name, but it's about the time series analysis of the brain, so EEG.
Oh, yeah. Beacon biosignals.
Yeah, exactly.
So I was fortunate enough to work with those folks for a short amount of time back in 2020. Created by Jarrett Revols and Jacob. I forget Jacob's last name, but Jarrett used to work as a research scientist at the Julia lab doing a bunch of Julia stuff. So he's been a longtime contributor to the Julia ecosystem, and Jacob was a MD, PhD student at Harvard and MIT, and did a bunch of awesome stuff. So he's an incredible medical mind, if you will. And Jarrett's really I think Jarrett's the CTO and did a bunch of Julia stuff. But yeah, they're using, and I don't know if I have a full grasp today on the work that they're doing. I know they're using Julia and machine learning to help improve the EKG process. I think the way that it was originally described to me is if you go into the hospital and you need an EKG run like on your brain to like make sure that you're in a good physical condition, it's like this really archaic process. Like the person who does it at the hospital is like not always there. They're like, you might go in, they're like, the person's not going to be here till tomorrow morning, so you have to wait until the next day or something like that. So really this old analog archaic process. And I actually think Beacon, at least at the time that I was involved and talking with them more actively, they actually were building some small piece of physical hardware to accompany the software platform that they were building, which I think is in the clinical trial space. And then the physical piece of hardware would, go onto your head, and you'd be able to sort of do these EKGs without being physically in the hospital or something to that. Okay. So really interesting work. I think they'll have us potentially a few videos maybe coming out at JuliaCon. I'm not sure, but I think an interesting company to keep an eye on.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and let me close with this one, which is I think it's an annoying question, but mention the 3 best Julia packages. Your favorite. Yes. I mean, the coolest, I don't know, the one that you said this is a cool application I didn't expect.
Yeah, so the first one that I'll start with is I think it's called iterm.jl, which is just a visual. It's a package that hooks into the Julia REPL and basically gives you the ability to do all this fancy stuff in the REPL that you normally, or in the terminal session, that you normally wouldn't be able to do. So it's a bunch of like visual things, like I don't know if it's like progress bars and all this other stuff. You can basically design into your own Julia package all of this functionality in the REPL to make it more interactive and more visual. And it seems really, really cool. So I haven't played around too much, but I follow and I forget the guy's name who is making it, but I follow him on Twitter, and I always see the stuff that he's working on. So I think it's iterm. iterm term.jl is the package. So that one looks really cool. Lots of cool visualizations and stuff on Twitter happening with that. Another one is, and I just think Flux is really cool because I like deep learning. So Flux is a big one. I think there's so much potential with Flux and so much happening in that ecosystem. So I'm really excited about what the next 3 years look like for that package and for that ecosystem. And then let's see, the third one. I think I'll probably say dataframes.jl, and the reason I think dataframes is such a fundamental package in the Julia ecosystem, but I also think that Bogomil and the other folks who help work on dataframes have done such an incredible job and made such an important contribution to the ecosystem, not only just with dataframes, but Bogomil, for example, has answered the most questions out of anybody on Stack Overflow in the entire ecosystem. So he's donated a tremendous amount of his time to help people learn Julia and with their problems and questions. And I think him and I'm going to butcher the name, but it's like Przemensky or something like that, which is basically his partner in crime. Those two are, and I think they won the Julia Community Award last year because of this such important work that they're doing. So I think huge shout out to them. And there's obviously so many other folks in the Julia ecosystem who are doing such great work. It's hard to.
Yeah. I knew it was an annoying question for this, but thank you for being able to how do you say, condensate it. Thanks a lot for the work you're doing. Thank you for the organization of the JuliaCon.
Yeah, I think I just want to make the quick disclaimer that there's a huge organizing committee for JuliaCon. So I'm obviously doing some of the work, but Valentin and Avik are the chairs for JuliaCon, and they're really leading things. And we have Katie and Michael Herbst leading the program this year, which is a tremendous amount of work, very, very difficult job. And they've done an awesome job leading that part of JuliaCon. And there's a bunch of other folks helping out with tons of other stuff across the entire conference. So yeah, huge shout out to all those folks. And JuliaCon would not be possible without people donating so much of their time and volunteering and really making it work. So it's such an important community initiative.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for clarifying. And again, thank you. Sorry, you're here, so I have to thank you. But thank you for your time and bringing in the voice of all the people that contributed to that. And I look forward to the conference. I recommend people listening to join if they see this before the conference, to go back to all the recordings. Everything is available, so absolutely worth spending time learning not only the language but things through the language. Not sure if you want to add something, but
totally.
Great. Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thanks, Matteo. Thanks for having me. I think this was a ton of fun. And again, if folks have questions about Julia or things that I can help out with, always feel free to get in touch with me online.
Great. Thank you.